Hello. So today I'm going to be making a 1920 style hat. But before I do, I have had a few queries on what I'm wearing to present or when I'm sewing. So I thought I must remember to start telling you what I'm wearing at the start of each video. I love it when other vintage or historical sewing YouTubers tell me what they're wearing. So I know I'm kind of hidden by the sewing machine a bit today, but just to show you, I am wearing this late 40s pistachio green hazy print dress, this rather fetching double collar, and a 40s enormous butterfly brooch with a kind of yellow polished stone centre and amber wings, and a 1950s half hat. I love 1950s half hats. They're so wearable and so pretty. So this is like just a little subtle brown velvet one with a little little cutout leaves around the brim. I often like to ask about these actually. I've got a little collection, although not as many as I would like, and they are true 40s crocheted cotton fingerless gloves. And of course, it was an easy way to add a little pop of colour to your outfit in the 40s for not very much money. And the same, of course, is true of handmade hats. And then I'm wearing these, which I often wear only to present or in reveals because they're too precious. They're 1930s Mabe pearl, how do I pronounce that? Mabe pearl earrings on with the hat. The hat I'm making is a 1920s cloche style hat. On that subject, the word cloche, somebody told me that cloche means bell in French, which I was going to say rings a bell, but I hadn't thought, and of course they are kind of bell shape. And on that subject, I'm so grateful to the person who told me that chenille is French for caterpillar, which came up in, of course, my chenille candlewick bedspread house robe. Yes, so I'm making this kind of cloche hat, and I used a pattern that I found on Etsy by a seller called Elsewhen Millinery, and I'll link her details below because she had lots. I think she was based in America. She had lots of gorgeous, simple to make, or if you have dressmaking skills, simple to make hat designs, and they're just PDF patterns. So it's a pattern from her, and I would say it's a combination of two popular hat styles in the 1920s, the cloche, which I've mentioned, and also the bicorn hat, kind of bicorn mini. It had a fold-up brim with kind of 2 points, and the bicorn hat kind of came from the musketeer hat of the early 20s, and the musketeer hat became popular because the film The Three Musketeers was released then, and who wouldn't want to look like a musketeer? So that style was popular, and it often had a feather or some kind of embellishment at the side. And this pattern was a little button at the side, but I decided to do some of my felt flowers, which you might remember from my felt flower video. Of course, in the 1920s, nobody went out without some kind of hat or head covering. And this style that I'm doing, kind of bicorn style or the cloche, tended to be worn with casual daytime or sporty looks. And the cloche, of course, was so popular, it was probably made of like felt for the daytime and perhaps more embellished in the evening. Because in modern times we don't wear hats as often, they're probably the easiest to wear out in public are the ones that were made for casual wear, and this is indeed one of those. And I would say that cloche hats, those 20 styles that kind of pull over, they are super cozy. If you're by the sea, which I am at the moment, those sea breezes, they keep your vulnerable ears really, they keep the chill out. They're definitely a really practical style of hat. And I was interested to read that Angelina Jolie, when she was wearing a cloche hat in The Changeling, said that she felt like she could kind of collect herself in it because she was in this little hazy world. Because, of course, the brim comes quite far down. You feel sort of protected. Although, and I don't know where that I got this image from. It might have been something like Jeeves and Wooster. I don't know. But anyway, the image is a raccoon peering out from under a flower pot. See? Yes. Hopefully that's not quite the effect that I'll achieve. Although there are worse things to look like, aren't there? What I was quite pleased with too in kind of deciding to make this hat was I am quite a frequenter of car boot fairs, and I've got loads of odds and ends of soft furnishing fabric that I thought I'll use for projects. And hat projects with scraps of soft furnishing fabric are absolutely perfect. So this hat would have cost me most outside of the pattern, but the materials probably about 50 pence. I did decide to use like a thermal interlining to give the hat a bit of structure, you know, to make it nice and firm and kind of super cozy. For a summer look you could just use fabric, but I wanted something for those sea breezes, so I did interline it. But on that note, let me show you how I got on and what the result looks like. And this is the offcut of soft furnishing fabric I bought at a car boot fair for very little, 50p or something. And as you can see, it's a subtle greyish blue with these spots of colour. And you can see the colours in there better if I turn over to the wrong side. They're kind of pinks and pale yellows. And I thought I might use the wrong side just on the pleats at the back, just on the underneath side of the pleats, so that when they're folded, as you can see, there'll just be that little peep through of those different coloured stripes. And the fabric pattern is just composed of these 3 pieces. The curved pyramid shape is for the crown, and there are 6 of those that need to be cut. And if you're doing a lining, 6 pieces of the lining as well. The brim just at the top there, and then the back where the pleats are going to be created. So I'm cutting out 6 of the crown pieces, and the seam allowance isn't included on the pattern, so you cut around leaving the seam allowance like I'm doing here. And I cut 6 pieces of this fabric, and I did start to run out of fabric, so I needed different, also scrap of soft finishing fabric for the lining. And the brim, I also didn't have enough to cut out the 2 pieces needed for the brim. So you can see I just had to piece one of the sides of the brim, which is a bit narrow at one point, but I'm sure it'll be okay. So I also decided to use a thermal interlining for the crown pieces. So I cut 6 pieces of that crown pattern piece, and I was really pleased that I used this thermal interlining. It gave the hat a really nice stable structure as well. I also cut out from adhesive interfacing 1 piece for the brim and also another piece for the pleated section at the back, because both those sections need to be stiffened. And then I sewed all the side seams of the crown pieces. That's 6 pieces for the crown. And I did that with the lining pieces as well. And I just left on both the right side of the crown and the lining just 1 seam open. And the reason for that is you can then try on your crown, the crown of the hat, and pin the seam so that you're making absolutely sure that the hat's going to fit. So although I measured my head and cut out the right size from the pattern before I started, obviously, although given last week maybe not so obvious, it's still a good idea to check. And you can see on my lining I have joined on that thermal fleece interlining to create my nice cozy hat. So I'm just going to kind of measure both those crown shapes before I stitch up the final seam. And here is my top crown, and I'm just putting in the lining piece with the right side of the lining fabric facing into the crown, obviously. And when you put the lining in, the pattern does say you'll be left with excess around the hem of the hat, even though they've been cut out in the same size, just the kind of thing of putting one shape inside the other. And you can see I'm really pressing it out. You don't want that lining to be too tight. You want it to really fill into the crown of the hat. So I'm just making sure that that's all secure by pinning around the edges before I cut off the excess. And of course I've made sure to align the seam lines of the right side and the lining, and then that's my crown all pinned together and ready to be joined to the brim and the pleats at the back. And those sections, the brim and the pleats at the back, are just stitched right sides together and with that interfacing pressed on as well. And that's just pointing at the stitching line of the brim. And then that's turned round to the right side, just making sure that the corners are all properly pressed out as well. And then I will press that shape. So with the interfacing, it's going to kind of hold its shape. And that's the brim pressed. So the raw edges are then cutting notches in them because they're going to be stitched around the crown of the hat. And then I'm using the pattern pieces to mark the center of the brim with a pin. And this is something in the pattern instructions, and it's so that I can align the center of the brim on the seam line of the crown of the hat, and then that's just pinned around the crown of the hat right side to right side and matching those raw edges, and as you can see, matching the seam line. So you can also see why the notches needed to be cut into that raw edge, because I'm stretching the brim around the circle of the crown of the hat. And I would definitely recommend strong pins for this project. My best ones are those kind of long glass-headed pins, and they went through the layers really well. But my shorter little pins, they all bent when I was trying to push them through the layers, and the layer situation only gets worse later on. This is the only project for which I've ever broken a sewing machine needle, but we'll come to that in a bit. So with that all pinned in place like that, it's then stitched around on the sewing machine, so that was easy enough. And that's how the brim is going to kind of fold upwards. And then it's time to stitch on what the pattern calls the sweatband, which in my case is a length of grosgrain ribbon. And this is the trickiest bit of the whole project. It's all right going around the back where the seam allowance, the raw edges at the edge are just turned inwards, and then you top stitch the grosgrain ribbon. But when you get to design, I'm showing you the bit where the brim is, you have to stitch exactly on that seam line where you stitch the brim on through the grosgrain ribbon, and that's quite a few layers, and it is where my machine needle broke, and then the grosgrain ribbon is just going to be slip stitched onto the lining. So you can see that hat shape start to take shape. And now we're onto the back where the pleats are going to be formed. So that's interface 2, and then I'm just turning it to the right side. And you might remember I decided to keep one side with the wrong side of the fabric, so that's where the pleats are going to peep through, and then that opening that I left to turn it right side to right side is just going to be slip stitched down, and just showing you how the pleats will look. So as the pleats, and you can just see, you'll get a little glimpse of stripe beneath the pleat, and the pleats are really easy to do. They're just, it's like machine stitching in a dart. They're just, I'm showing you, just machine stitched along like that part way down, so that they form these little kind of fan shape, isn't it, really? And then the whole thing is then just attached around the back of the hat, and that is just hand stitched into position, so it fits exactly from one edge of the brim to the other edge of the brim. And I'm just pointing out there's a button at the edge, but I'm not going to use a button. I'm going to do some of my felt flowers, and these are the felts that I found that match those stripes or spots on the right side that run through the fabric, just those kind of pastels. So I've made some spring flowers as we're in spring, and I'm going to attach those where the button on the pattern was, and make a design with some leaves and stems. So I'm going to create a little design there, which I think is quite in keeping with those original Byhorn hats that we saw at the beginning. So I'm going to do all my hand sewing for the hat now, and that includes just attaching the pleated back section around the crown of the hat before I'm ready to show you the reveal. And I'm wearing my completed 1920s style hat with a true vintage late 1920s deco green coat. And I can tell you that it's so worth making hats yourself. They're not that difficult to make, and the difference in having a hat that truly fits you is amazing. You don't realise how hats generally slide around on your head until you have one that just slides on and fits perfectly. Yes, you could see someone with her squirrel toy not happy about being left out of this week's video. In fact, determined not to be left out. And to show you a close-up of the hat, which I'm wearing with the brim turned up, like more like a kind of Byhorn style. And those are my felt flowers, when I have a video on making felt flowers if you're interested in seeing how I do them. And you can also see that pleated detail at the side too. And the 1940s has crept in a bit with the Scotty dog brooch, only because it's the exact same green as my coat. And yes, I've given in to her. I always do. Thank you so much for watching us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. And please like this video and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.